first, let's stretch our ears a little bit. I'm going to play you some stuff. And I think for this first one, I just want you to listen for how sound is a character in the piece, and listen for the transitions that are used. And then we'll talk about them. I've had the great fortune over the years. So I've been mixing documentaries and short packs and long packs and what have you for better part of 15 years. The first real light bulb for me was when I was really lucky. I was working across the way on the second floor for a show called Take 5 on CBC Radio 2 back in the day. I'd just gotten my first gig here at CBC. And they said, hey, there's secondments available. Would you like to apply for the secondment program? And I said, yes. And someone recommended that I take a secondment with Bandwidth in Ottawa, which at the time was produced by Bill Stunn, who's an audio wizard. And so I got to spend a week with Bill Stunn, which was amazing. He taught me WaveLab. That's when I really discovered what you could do with sound. And WaveLab at the time wasn't available on Macs, so I went out and bought Pro Tools, and I started teaching myself Pro Tools, and that's how I got into working with sound. And then I had the great fortune of being paired up with Chris Brooks, who is the senior professor of freelance radio in Canada. He is an audio luminary, according to Third Coast Audio Festival in Chicago. And he has been a freelance radio producer for many, many years. He lives in St. John's, Newfoundland, at the foot of the cliffs where Marconi received the first transatlantic radio signal. He lives at the birthplace of radio, in the fifth last house before the Atlantic Ocean. And that's where he works, and that cliff in St. John's is called the Battery. And so he lives in the Battery, and his company's called Battery Radio. I encourage you to look it up. Chris.
I encourage you not to drive in the Battery.
True. Chris has been a great mentor to me, and I'll be talking a lot about Chris over the morning. So this is Chris's piece that I'm going to play you. It's the first 4 minutes of a piece he did about almost 10 years ago. It's called Map of the Sea.
Okay, this is a recording of the Fort Amherst foghorn. I make a lot of recordings, like this one. This is the sound of fog rolling into the harbor past my house. When I'm recording, it's the sound of the present. I put the tape on a shelf, and when I play it back, days or weeks or years later, of course, it's become the sound of the past. A little spool of memory, measuring the gap between then and now. And I feel like there's something sad about the gap, but I don't know why. It's just things changing. Of course, this isn't really the sound of fog. Fog is something you can't hear on the radio. This is a foghorn, a thing that evolved entirely because of fog. So it's kind of like the voice of fog.
Da 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 da. Da, 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 da. Okay, how about that?
I made this recording of the singer Anita Best last summer.
Ready?
A navigation song.
From Bonneville Cape to the Stinking Isles, the course is north, full 40 miles. When you must steer away northeast, till Cape Friel, Skull Island, bear northwest. Then northwest 33 miles, 3 leagues offshore lies Wadham's Isles, whereof a rock you must take care. 2 miles south-southeast from miles it bears. Sometimes songs were used as navigational aids for people who couldn't really read charts and maps. You wanted to know how much water was under your vessel, and you wanted to you be able to make the right turns to get around the reefs and rocks and stuff, you know.
So it's kind of a sung map.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in a symbolic kind of way, yeah. So we used to sing our way around in the world like the Australians have the song lines, yeah. It's an interesting idea to find your way around in the world by song. Therefore, my friend, I would you advise, since all those rocks in danger lies, that you may never amongst them fall, but keep your luff and weather them all.
A friend of mine likes to point out that Newfoundland is the oldest non-Aboriginal culture in the Americas. Before the Plains Indian had the horse, we were here singing the fishing grounds. Like the foghorn with the fog, we evolved entirely because of the fish. And for 5 centuries, we sang, we danced, we spoke the language of fish. Our culture was their voice. Then, suddenly, the fish were gone. It was 12 years ago. The tapes on my shelf sound like this.
In the news tonight, net loss. Atlantic groundfish stocks nosedive amid warnings of economic disaster in the maritime fishery.
It's a major social and economic catastrophe. That's the best way of saying it.
How do you feel? What's going through your mind?
Well, it works. It made me cry. But I'm from Newfoundland, so that like, oh my God. There's something about having the, he's sneaky. He's sneaky the way he gets into that story.
Right.
I thought that was really interesting. And the sound of the sound of the water and the foghorn is so tranquil. That it does something to me as a listener. It calms me down. It makes me feel peaceful, so I am open to hear the story that's to follow.
Right on.
Then he follows with Anita Best's voice, who, by the way, I recognized before he introduced me. And with the, it's too much, guys. I can say and so he's got Anita's voice with that beautiful reverb, so it's so soft. And so it kind of, to me, it like the quality of the sound mirrors or flows so nicely from the sound, the shimmer of the water. And again, it's so intimate. Just her voice with that reverb, you're in the room with her. And so I'm so wide open, and then he knocks me with the moratorium. Mm-hmm. Too much. It's really good. It's really, really good, but it's sneaky the way he opens you up as a listener for what's to follow.
Yeah. I found like everything sounded so, like if you're listening to it as a radio producer, it's so intentional. Mm-hmm. Like he's made so many choices, but as a listener, if you're just listening, you're just, like you said, you're sort of open to it. And even just the way that he's like mic'd the voices, like when she's singing, you can hear every like little bit of almost saliva. You know what I mean? Like it's so, yeah, it was great.
And it's smart too, like making fog a character in a sense, right? That it's a very, it's sneaky for sure, and it's not obvious, and then it becomes
And the writing is so nice.
Yeah.
Just like so many, not so Bash BBC, but so many times would have done that story, it would have been like, so-and-so is walking down the river.
There's
no fish there.
There's a musicality to the writing, which leads into the sound.
I've heard this piece, I've heard this piece a few times, and I'm always like, I struggle with story structure. I'm like, I don't understand how people make it work so well. And this time, I was like, oh my God, he like leads with sound. Like he finds the sound for the story, and he lets the sound unfold and the sound lead the story. Is that like?
That's absolutely bang on.
It's crazy.
But I would say also what he's done is he's given a sense of place, like right from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So like that's how we, like so often, well I don't know, for on Spark anyway, like when I'm dealing with freelancers, the main thing I'm like, why are you telling the story? Why don't I just tell the story?
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? And usually the reason should be you can create a sense of place. Like you are somewhere that I'm not. I'm sitting here in Toronto. But I could tell it. You could tell that story. The fishery, blah, blah, blah. You could tell that story. You could use Anita. You could do all those things. But he is there, and the way we know he's there is the sound of the fog and the tapes on his shelf.
Yeah.
That's creating a sense of place even more than any. That was what struck me about it.
You guys
place.
hit on so many great points, which is wonderful, and all the ones that are important to me about this piece. This is my desert island piece of radio. I can hear this. It still makes me emotional after having heard it over and over again for 10 years almost. So I think there's immense power in the way this piece is put together for all the reasons that you guys have touched on. The two main ones that jump out to me, which is a lot, but number one, leading with the sound, making the sound a character, is kind of turning upside down the way we normally work. Because normally the way we approach our work, we're under the gun a lot, frequently, that's part of it. But we're making information radio. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We're journalists making information radio. So there's not a lot of time or space to think about sound as a character. That doesn't seem to be part of our wheelhouse, right? We're there to tell stories, and the stories are in the words. However, there's a lot of information in sound, as you heard in this piece. And we forget that sound is information. And it's often very powerful information. It's often more powerful than the words can convey. Music is also information, and music also has that power. And the first sort of thing that I'd like to have the takeaway here is that there's 3 different kinds of sound that we listen to on the radio, and they each affect us differently, and actually affect different parts of our brains. So there's information, there's talk, standard information, right, which sort of affects more the cerebral cortex, sort of language processing areas of the brain. Then there's sound, which gets us on a much more instinctive level, where we respond to sound. I'm talking about natural sound, whether it's the sound of a foghorn, the sound of the water, the sound of somebody typing on their computer, whatever that kind of natural world ambient sound that we gather. That affects us that gets us in a different place, an instinctive place. We're responding to sound instinctively. We do that. We're built to respond to sound. It's the first sense we experience in the womb. And then music, which gets us all over the brain, has been demonstrated that music, when we're listening to music, all kinds of regions of the brain are activated. So you have these 3 different ways of engaging the listener, and each of them has its own information. And to remember that sound contains information and sound can be used as a character is something that I think is a really powerful tool to keep in your toolkit. To find, that's what Chris does. He finds the sound in every piece. He finds the sound that determines that it's the sound of the piece. What of the sounds that I've gathered for this story, which sound is the core sound of this story? And then he makes that sound a character. In almost everything that he does, I've heard him do that. He makes the sound a character. I want to touch a bit more on sound before I get to the second major point. That foghorn leading into Anita Best is one of the best transitions.
Oh my God.
That,
Yeah,
you know,
played it to her to get her to be on the same key? Like,
I don't know if he did.
No.
I think
what?
he.
You think that was
No,
he wasn't in the
I
same
think he
key?
just took the.
But he got her to echo him, or the fog. It was so amazing.
So the test that she does, that's a mic test, right?
Yeah.
Like he says, okay, let's do a mic test.
That was just coincidence. Come on.
And
She's not in the same key. She's not in the same key.
She's not in the same
It
key.
sounded like such a perfect echo.
Well, he made it an echo.
Mhm.
And see, now actually, Kristen, now, I've never actually asked him whether he did that intentionally or not. So now I'm going to have to ask him.
Yeah.
But I have always assumed that he found the echo himself in what he heard when he recorded her. That's what I've assumed. Because often that's how it happens, right? It's an organic thing that happens where you're in the field, you have a sound, you're in the field, you have another sound, and the two of them have some connection that you can draw on. I don't know if you noticed, but she comes in and she goes, and then she does her little test. And then she says, is that all right? And I love that. I love that, he through this whole piece, he's got references to the craft of radio making as well. The tapes on his shelf, the rehearsal check, all of that stuff. It lets the listener in. It makes the listener feel like a part of the journey. But then, she introduces herself or introduces her, I can't remember. And then he brings back the 3 or 4 times, just like the foghorn, right? It's the voice of the fog, and then the voice carries on and echoes So that's all done without, there's a tiny bit of beautifully applied reverb on her voice. Absolutely true. But apart from that, that's just placement of clips. That's all it is. It's not fancy effects or plugins. It's just listening for the sounds and laying them out and deciding to make a music out of the sounds. It creates its own music and rhythm. So that's another thing that I think is wonderful about that piece. On the other side, on the more informational side, that's a piece about fish. You don't even hear about fish until 3 minutes and 30 seconds
But you
through.
care about the fish.
But you
already,
care
right?
about the
Like that's-
fish.
You care about the
By the
sea
time you
and
hear about it, boy, do you care about the fish. And I think that that's another thing that I've, in my experiences working with Chris, has been a central part of our approach, is that radio is not a classroom. We really believe that radio is not a classroom. When program development first started, I pitched a show, like the very beginning of program development, I pitched a show called The Wire, The Impact of Electricity on Music. It was an 8-part series. And the first thing that happened was they said, well, we're considering funding this idea, but first we'd like to put you together with Chris Brooks for 2 weeks. That's how we met, to develop the idea further. So I went out to Newfoundland for a week, and we hung out in his house, drinking a lot of espresso and listening to a lot of stuff and talking about stuff. And we sort of drafted these kind of, I guess, it was kind of a bit like a manifesto. And number one on the manifesto was, it's radio, it's not a classroom. And I think sometimes when we get caught up in our information transmitting function as information radio makers and journalists, we're telling stories, and it's our habit and it's our methodology to tell people up front what the story's about. We tell people what the story's about usually, right? I mean, we say, coming up next, a story about this, and then the first thing is, this story is about. I mean, not in so many words, but often that's how we start things.
Often. That's it.
Right?
When clips are the worst, people do that. They say in a documentary or in a piece, you know, they set up the clip, and then the clip, the first thing the person says is what the narrator just said.
What the narrator just said.
It's
So
like
true.
the number one thing I do is cut off the last sentence before every clip in like 90% of the documentaries.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Just always just delete that sentence without even looking at it, because they're always saying the same thing.
We do a lot of telling in radio. I mean, that's what we do. It's a central part of what we do. But there's that whole show don't tell philosophy from creative nonfiction and from fiction and from other arts that I think is a really useful thing to keep in mind for radio. Even the straightest information radio, because sometimes just the smallest change of letting the sound lead or not introducing the story straight up front can invite the listener in. And Chris has a beautiful way of putting this. He says, you know, you don't want to like put the listener on a leash and lead them. You don't want to push the listener into something. What you want is the listener to see this great big swimming pool in front of them of story and sound that they just want to jump in with you. So you want to invite the listener into the swimming pool. That's how the opening of the piece should feel. It should be an invitation to the listener to jump into the swimming pool. So that's the second big point that I wanted to make. Let's listen to something else.
Where did that air?
That aired on a show produced by a company in the States called Homelands Productions. It was a series that they were doing, and I can't remember what the particular series or the particular show
It never
was.
aired on the CBC.
I don't know if it did. It may have, but I don't know if it did. Okay. Let's listen to Pike Malinowski. Anybody heard of Pike Malinowski? Pike is a Danish producer who lives in Brooklyn and is a poet as well as a radio producer, and he's very, very creative. This piece was produced in the last year or so, and it won 2 awards, one for radio fiction, one for radio documentary, which tells you a lot about how it's hard to place. It's wonderful. I'm not going to say too much about it. Listen for the space in this piece. I'd like you to listen for that as we listen. And we'll just go.
Everything.
A city where more than 7 million people live in peace and enjoy the benefits of democracy.
Nothing. Harvey Keitel.
You don't build a house from the roof down. You build it from the foundation up.
The foundation is the soul.
The foundation is the body.
The sound of a room. An old industrial space, cement floor, tall ceilings. About 60 people shuffling into a room, looking for a seat. And the sound of the city beyond the room, New York City. A bell, the sound of a bell ringing out. And a voice, this voice, a self, or as it's known from the inside, I am meditating, or I'm learning to meditate, or I'm trying to learn to meditate, but I'm distracted by the man sitting next to me.
Let's begin with a meditation, which I'll guide you through. You can just sit comfortably and be at ease.
Another voice, the voice of the woman who's guiding us through the meditation.
Close your eyes or not, whatever you feel comfortable with.
I found an empty chair next to an older, scruffy-looking guy. Wild, fuzzy hair tucked under a red bandana, like he had just blown in from a New Jersey truck stop.
The first instruction begins with simply hearing. Simply listen to the sounds around you.
I knew that I knew him. There was this immediate sense that I'd known him for a long time and we'd been through a lot together. You know, like a cousin you used to play with, but now you've both grown up and you forget his name. But flipping through the photo album of my mind, the pages were blank.
As you sit comfortably, you may hear external sounds. You may hear internal sounds. You may hear certain qualities of silence.
Inside this first silence that we shared was suddenly a cough. A quiet cough, but a cough that revealed a large, rumbling voice. And that's when I realized that I was sitting next to the famous actor, Harvey Keitel.
We begin with hearing because it points to some of the natural qualities of mindfulness.
And immediately I started thinking about all the things Harvey Keitel might be thinking about.
We don't have to define the sounds as being a certain thing.
Or all the things Harvey Keitel was trying not to think about.
We don't have to manipulate them.
Or I was trying not to think about all the things Harvey Keitel was trying not to think about.
We don't have to do anything about them in order to hear them. Simply listen.
Harvey Keitel, a physical reality in the chair next to me, but also an idea in my mind. My idea of Harvey Keitel projected onto the chair next to me. And my memory of all the parts he's ever played, like the corrupt police officer in Bad Lieutenant.
So, what are you feeling? What are you thinking?
The idea of the pool really came out to me with this one especially, because in the beginning I was like, what is this about? But I was totally open to taking that journey with him.
Right, you don't know it's about meditation until
No.
part of the way in, right?
But each sound really intrigued me. It kept me thinking, and it kept me engaged in what I was listening to.
He did bills, right? It was bills, like for what was going on, but we didn't know that. I love that.
Yeah.
That's great. But the Danish make the best radio.
They do. They're so
They never
smart.
do any wrong. But like, I don't know. It was all foreshadowing at the beginning. I love
Right.
it. Yeah.
And so that he's giving all this information without hitting you over the head with it, right?
I feel like there's such a big payoff when you connect the dots. Like I
Yeah.
felt so satisfied
Yeah.
when I was
Like,
like, oh, I'm in
oh.
his head.
Yeah.
It was nice. Yeah.
And that's something that we often forget, is that our listeners are super smart, right? They enjoy that kind of payoff when you let them in on the little trick, or you set up something and deliver on it instead of just telling everything right up front, right?
Because I have to admit, I felt like, oh my God, this is going to be really self-indulgent. It's a Danish guy talking about meditation. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, like he's thinking exactly what if I was trying to meditate next to Harvey Keitel, I would totally be thinking the same thing. Yeah. So at one point I thought I was disconnected from the piece, and then I was like, oh my God, we're here together. Like this is exactly what I would do.
Well, it's interesting, thinking about your idea, Elizabeth, about reverse engineering and how do you do that. Like, the idea is, I did a meditation class with Harvey Keitel. Like, I've got a friend who did a meditation class and realized he was sitting next to Leonard Cohen, and my friend had a runny nose, and Leonard Cohen gave him a tissue. And that's the story, right? So that's the story. But then he decided to tell it this way. So that's the interesting thing for me. Like, you've got this idea. How do you reverse engineer and decide to? How do you know where to go in through the side door?
It wasn't clever for clever's sake.
Right.
It totally served the purpose.
Exactly. Yeah.
Completely served the purpose. You understood why he was. I would never have been able to do that myself. But once you hear what he's trying to say, you completely understand why he's saying it the way he's saying it.
Yeah, and the self-indulgence goes.
Just like I was kind of with you, and then I was like, wow, this totally makes sense.
That's a great point, and I think that's one of the things that I feel is underrepresented in the way we approach making things. So keep that point in mind. Especially when you're working with sound, and especially when you're working with music, and we'll talk about that when we talk about scoring, is the best stuff that you make is going to be the stuff where you inherently feel that everything serves the purpose of the story, that whatever and I've often, I think probably the greater part of what I've made is stuff where I feel like, oh, well, I put that in because I couldn't find anything else, and I put that in because it felt like the right thing to put in at the time, and I listen back and I think, well, it's okay. Nothing wrong with it. I was listening to the Sunday edition this morning. I don't know if anyone else heard there was a little mini doc on internet doppelgangers.
Doc Project Doc.
Yay!
Yay. Molly Siegel, yeah.
And it was cool. It was great, and there was nothing wrong with it. I do have some small criticisms, but again,
it's okay. It's my first time doc maker.
so about the scoring in particular, and I think that there are little tiny things that are fine. Like, there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. It was entertaining. I followed along, but there were just 2 or 3 tiny, minor little tweaks that I would have made that would have subconsciously made it feel, I think, a lot better to the average listener. And when we talk about scoring, maybe we'll talk about that particular piece. But just to make that point about, oftentimes it's just the way it is. And it's going to be fine, even if you don't nail it, even if it's not perfect. But those pieces that are going to be the ones that sing are the ones where everything serves the purpose, whether it's the narration and the way that it's set up, or the sound, or the music that you choose. And that's.
The thing you did was the cough. Sorry, can I say?
Yeah, for sure.
The cough came before.
Yeah, the cough came before.
You didn't say, and then there was a cough. Cook.
Yeah, that's what I do all the time. I'm always flipping the sound.
And
the
the
sound
cough
first,
came
and
like
then
5 or 10 seconds before he even mentioned it.
And you didn't even know if he was going to acknowledge the cough.
Yeah.
And you're like, is he? And then he
just
you're like,
satisfying,
phone
right?
rang.
Ring, right? Like,
was also
I'm at my computer. Click, click, click. Like, it's just.
It was also about finding the tension in that moment, because if you've ever been in a meditation class and you cough, or the creak of the chair, which is like, those are all real, like, we're talking about tension and story. It doesn't have to be that someone's having an argument. Like, those are really tense moments when you're in a meditation class and you realize that you sat in a creaky chair.
Yes.
And you're going to have to live with it for the next hour and be extremely still, more than anyone else. So I like that he sort of drew frames around the existing tensions and then, like, boosted them up.
Did you have any sense of how much of that was real, authentic sound, and how much of that was mixed? Because the sound that he used right off the top served exactly the purposes that he wanted it to.
Yeah.
And I would just wonder, like, was there a very intricate mix to put all of those pieces together?
Documentary.
Or did he stick his microphone around until he found exactly the authentic kind of?
That's something that I've spoken about with other people, and I know Pike, and I'm going to ask him eventually, the next time I speak to him, about whether or not how he approached the making of it. But while we're talking about the making of it, let's talk about the space in it, because I think that one of the things that works is the sense of space, right? You feel the room. He describes it beautifully in his script at the beginning, because he's meditating, which on repeated hearings, from the beginning he's meditating, and you hear it slightly differently, and it's kind of cool, right? Because you're in on it already, and so you think, oh, he's already meditating, right? You just kind of listen to it a bit differently, but the room, you feel the room, the distance of the teacher, the closeness of his own voice, right? He's really, really close to the mic. He's speaking in a really intimate tone of voice. It's not a narrator, right? I call that tone the Brooks Wonder tone, because Chris does it in The Map of the Sea too at the beginning when he's talking about the fog, right? And there's both a wondering and a sense of wonder in the tone.
And it's an inside voice. It's not a presentation voice.
Mm-hmm.
It's an inside voice. It's so intimate.
It's not a presentation.
Where do you think they voiced that? Like, it's not in the studio?
I think that he probably voiced it in some kind of home studio setup, and he probably voiced it really, really close and intentionally doing that close recording. The chair and how it sounds and where it sounds, this is all the space of it, right? And that part of that going into his head is being aware of the space around and feeling that, if you've meditated, feeling that sense, or if you've never meditated, imagining what it's like to be in that kind of setting. We've all been in similar kinds of settings when he sets the tone with the space. And that's sort of another point that I want to make about sound, is that I think frequently when we get caught in the rut, because we have to be, frankly, that's part of why we get caught in the rut, is because it's just go, 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 but we're making usually two-dimensional radio for the most part, where it's some sound and a clip, and we duck the sound and we put the clip up, or it's some music. Especially with music, it can be really two-dimensional, right? When it's just sort of music, clip. I mean, nothing against that doc this morning, which was entertaining and smart and witty, and there was lots that was good about it, but from a sound perspective, there was a two-dimensionality to it, because it's just music and talk. You duck the music, you have the talk, you bring it back, and I think that it's important to recall and remember that sound is three-dimensional. We experience sound three-dimensionally, and we can make sound three-dimensional on the radio. A brief side note to say that, unfortunately, even if we make sound three-dimensional on the radio, on Radio 1, sadly, that's not the way most listeners are going to experience it, which I still don't get why Radio 1 has to be in mono, but it is, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work in stereo, because also our work goes out on the internet now. And it may still frequently go out in mono, depending on how your show is supposed to be uploaded to the internet, but if you make a doc, chances are good that it will be heard somewhere in stereo by somebody, and ought to be. and I think that is something to bear in mind. And even if you put something that was mixed with that sense of space on mono, you're still gonna, some of that is gonna be transmitted in the Radio 1 experience. So I'll briefly mention one of the little ways of getting around the fading rut, which I'll get at more closely when we get into the Pro Tools, which is that I think that the simplest thing to do with music, especially, is just to go music, clip, duck music, down, and is such a bread and butter part of what we do, and that's the way we deal with music, because that's just what you do with music in a radio piece. I mean, it's just something that we learn early on, and it becomes a tool, that you can develop some facility with, and then it expands your arsenal, and but then it becomes the rut. And one of the ways that you can add space, which I'll show you in a Pro Tools session, and I'll show you in Dalet after, to working with just simple music, is that instead of just fading down, you fade down and you fade up, and you fade out space-wise by adding a little bit of reverb. So that the music, instead of just going down volume-wise, the music disappears in space as well. So I'll illustrate that a bit. And that's part of this whole space piece. Having an extra tool, having an extra dimension to add to your sound, even if you're only working with music and text, you can still have that extra dimension added. Okay.
The other thing too is if you can find motivated music, like coming back to what Chris Brooks did off the top. Like, I don't know, did he go to her because she had that beautiful voice, or did he go to her because she knew what he was talking about in the piece, or did he go to her because she had both of them? Because that music, I mean, it completely serves the purpose of the story.
And that's true. That's a big part of that story, is the intentionality of his choice of speaking to Anita Best and having her up front in the story.
Yeah, because initially when you're hearing it, you think, well, this is beautiful, but what does she have to say? And then it turns out that she has a lot to say about exactly what he's talking about.
Anita Best will make another appearance this morning for another documentary that Chris and I worked together. And it's she's a folk singer, but the documentary is about plate tectonics, so go figure. But she had something to say about it. Wow. So I think sometimes it's also when you're the plate tectonics documentary is a large scale doc about a big topic, and when we sat down to plan it out, we were very intentional about, we're going to speak to painters, we're going to speak to folk singers, we're going to speak to poets, and we'll speak to geologists. We're not just going to speak to geologists to get at this idea of plate tectonics. So that's a big part of it too, for sure. I want to play you.
OCD about this, but where did that piece air?
Oh, sure. You can find it online. The Truth is a podcast, which is a fiction podcast with Jonathan Mitchell, and he, I think during the summer last year when he was on hiatus, he released this episode. This is an episode of The Truth, so you can find it there. Everything, Nothing, Harvey Keitel, and it's so good for the whole 20 minutes. It's well worth listening to. Okay, I want to play you a bit of a documentary that Chris and I did called Hark, the Acoustic World of Elizabethan England, where we tried to imagine what the world sounded like in 1600. And the idea came from this book that Chris read by an academic on how sound was thought of and perceived in that time, which is very different from the way we think of sound today. And also the sound world was very different. So we decided, well, this would be an interesting topic to explore. And so we did, along with Alan Hall of the BBC. And Chris went to England and he made a bunch of recordings. We interviewed the Foley artist who did Shakespeare in Love to get at how do you reimagine Shakespeare's time if you're making a movie about Shakespeare. Chris went to a farm, he went to a castle. We approached it from all different angles. I want to play you just this short section where the whole concept is introduced, partially for our conversation about sound. So this is not just for the way it sounds, but also for what it says, and also for the way it sounds. So let's have a listen to this.
I'm Bruce Smith. I'm a professor of English at the University of Southern California, and I was reading somewhere that every sound that had ever been made within the Earth's atmosphere still exists somewhere, however faint those frequencies are, and that if we just had the right kind of technical equipment, we could hear the voice of perhaps Shakespeare himself playing the ghost in Hamlet. And I asked myself then, are the sounds of the past gone forever?
Good exercise.
It's excellent exercise, absolutely. It's about just under 200 steps all the way to the top, so we'll have done them all by the time we go, don't worry.
All of us live in a distinctive soundscape, whether we pay attention to it consciously or not.
You do these every day, I presume?
I don't, fortunately.
We're part of a sound world. I think what's changed is our awareness of those sounds and our lack of acuity in being able to hear what is out there to hear for all of us.
We're on the top of the tower at St Mary le Bow in London. The sort of things you can see from here are the church there is St Michael's Cornhill.
That place with the dome?
It's the tower just up left from the dome.
Oh yes.
That's St Michael's Cornhill, and you've got some of the big places in the city.
When we look at something, we feel as if we're casting our gaze, that it's starting with us and it's moving toward an object that's out there. Actually, in Shakespeare's time, there were still many people who thought that that's exactly what happened when you look, that light beams were actually sent out from your eyes and touched the object that you were looking at and then came back to your eyes.
and off in the distance you can see Canary Wharf right in the distance.
I feel very much in control of what I see.
That's that tent-like structure there that says Canary Wharf?
It's right out in the distance. So behind the cranes there you can see
yes.
those ones.
Hearing works the other way around. When we listen to something, we're locating the source of the sound, not in ourselves, but in the object that's making the sound. So it's an exact reversal.
Would you close your eyes and tell me each sound that you hear?
Okay, I can hear a helicopter in the distance. I think I can hear an air conditioning unit. I can hear a bus.
Hearing is not linear. It's like a sphere.
Certainly the brakes of a bus. There's an aeroplane somewhere in the distance.
We are surrounded by sound.
There's certainly lots of traffic.
Sound is above us, below us, behind us, to our right, to our left.
And I can't hear any people or any birds or any bells.
Sound is a totally enveloping experience.
Yes, it's certainly, predominantly it's the traffic noise and the aircraft that you hear.
We're immersed in the sound.
Thoughts, feelings, observations, curses.
That opening, him talking about the whole idea that every sound still exists, but just him talking about that, it kind of like blows your mind, that whole concept. And it was a great, that whole idea, like kind of putting that idea at the beginning, just really.
Well, and then to go from that
yeah.
to those really clunky sort of steps, all you're thinking is that sound going to exist like 400 years from now?
And it
Like
just
that's
makes
what
it kind of blows your mind to think that whole concept, that whole idea of all sound still kind of exists. So it's kind of a crazy idea to put at the beginning, which was great, I thought.
Cool. Other thoughts?
It was really inclusive when he got up to the top, because it was, like you said, it was kind of informative in terms of conveying stuff. And then they got to the top and he said, close your eyes. And then immediately you're there with him trying to hear what he is hearing.
Right.
You know, like at that point, I did feel some distance until that point, and then you're there with him.
Yeah.
You're like standing on top of the thing and, okay, am I hearing the same thing that he's hearing? You know, it was, I mean, again, it seems like one of the things we're often trying to do is try to invite the audience into the same experience that you are having in making the documentary, and that was a really effective way to put someone right there.
Although I feel like in some ways it demands a lot of a listener. I don't know, like lots of people listen here with their eyes closed, but like people actually don't listen that way. They're doing other things. So I mean it's I'd be interested. It would be interesting to sort of know like who the person in the kitchen, or the person, like maybe if you're driving it would be a better experience, but I find that I did think that this is challenging, I think, for people for sure, to sort of get what you're putting out there in the context of how people actually listen to radio. Sorry.
No, that's an important point. I mean, I'll respond to that. I think happily we're in an age now where some people are just listening, and so we don't want to exclude them either. And I think that's one part of it. But another part of it is it also depends on the story and the topic. So, you know, if you're telling a story about Iraqi refugees arriving in Vancouver, you're probably the treatment is going to be probably a bit different from this kind of much more. I mean, it's an out there topic. It's already an esoteric topic that is maybe not going to grab everybody. So you do what you can to try and grab people through the inclusiveness that you mentioned, John. And but it's a valid point. I think that what I try to do is I try to make it so that if somebody is only listening in their kitchen for 2 or 3 minutes, there's something for them to take away from it, whatever it may be. That's a 3-minute section of a 54-minute documentary, right? But it does say something, even though it's only 3 minutes. And I think that is a useful way to approach that too, to sort of remember that even if you're making something that's 54 minutes long, chances are many people are only actually going to hear 3 minutes of it. Even if you're making something that's 20 minutes long, chances are most people are only going to hear 3 minutes of it, so those 3 minutes better be good. So all of the 3 minutes better,
Yeah.
you know, all the chunks better be good, right? Yeah. So I mean, but it's a great point, Donna. But it's also just part of the limitation of our craft, actually of the medium, because the medium is in transition. Because once upon a time, like when Hark first aired, it aired on Ideas in 2009, I want to say. Yeah, 2009. This is actually before the revolution took place in audio, which is shocking because it's only 6 years ago, right? But that is before the audio revolution really started to take hold. The revolution started 5 or 6 years before that, but it really took off, you know, only in the last couple of years. And I think when Hark aired, there were still people, and there are still people, who do listen to Ideas in that way, who sit down, and they're probably older, and they sit down and do listen to documentaries in that way. But now they have been joined by a younger generation of people who do listen to documentaries in a completely different context and in a completely different way. And in between, there's all the busy people who don't have time to listen to documentaries, such as myself. I mean, I have a 4-year-old. I'm in school right now. I'm working half-time. I've got a show that I do half-time, and the rest of the time I'm doing a master's in journalism at UBC. It's a busy time. I don't have a lot of time to listen to documentaries. And so I'm probably that person who's only going to hear 3 or 4 minutes of something, like I did this morning on the Sunday edition, right? So, but then I still get something from that experience. So I don't think that should prevent us from trying to take risks, but I think it's something to definitely bear in mind. So I'm glad you brought it up.
I think in that one though, if I may, I missed the closeness of the intimacy of the Danish dude and and your mentor.
Because it's an academic talking, and you can tell, right?
You can tell,
totally.
but I
Big
didn't
ideas.
know why I wanted to go along. Like he wasn't telling me what I was really going along with. It was like super bongy and like, okay, this is like way over there.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm totally open to super bongy, let's go. But I didn't know why with him. Like, why am I going with you? That was what was missing for me.
No, absolutely.
He did not. There was something, I don't know.
And I chose this more for the conversation about sound that he has, and the not less for the listen to this, it's amazing, but more for the fact that he talks about light and sound, and I wanted to get that thought process going, and also for the last 20 seconds of the piece, which
where he introduces slowly over top of all the sounds around, introduces whatever that was, that bed of sound, and it just went on and on and on. Like, that is brave, I think.
you should hear the pigs later in the piece. Yeah.
You know, like
More on that later. But
I thought it was like to feel comfortable enough to let something sustain for a long period of time. And in a sense, I didn't hear the pigs, but I can imagine if you're really trying to bring a person inside the sonic world of the 16th century or the 1600s, whatever, being there for a long period of time is what's going to allow you to actually feel that experience. Just hearing it and then letting it go after 5 seconds is not going to get you inside that time and that world.
I didn't even notice it went on. It didn't feel long to me at all. Like it must have been, but I was like, I didn't even notice. I was just so like listening for things, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting.
So was that a transition point? Like was
it was a transition point, and that's where we're going to get into Pro Tools from this transition point. I just want to address what Michelle said, because I remembered when you said that, how Chris starts the whole piece. He always has a fun idea for how to get into things. So this is not the very beginning of the piece. And what he did was he called payphones in London, and he asked people to hold up the phone for 30 seconds and say, what do you did? Where are you? And can you just hold up the phone for 30 seconds? And so there was a bit of a section before this that got into this whole kind of didactic, esoteric, bongy. That's a great word, bongy. So yeah, it was bongy, but just so you know, that came after another thing that Chris did. But what he did there at the end was he took the actual sound that he recorded in situ on the roof of St. Mary-le-Beau in London, which was the air conditioner and the helicopter and the bus and everything the guy described, and he started to run it through some effect filters. So it's actually the same sound, but it's affected in a way to create an imaginary sound world, an imaginary soundscape. And we're transitioning there from the real world of being on top of a bell tower into an imaginary world where some other stuff is going to happen. And that's a great place to use effects, is to enter into an imaginary soundscape, what you might call the landscape of the imagination. So there's scenes which are still a vital part of what we do. And then, because we want to take people to where things are happening. And it's tempting to use music, it's tempting to use effects in a way you always want to try and make things more interesting, dress things up. But sometimes you would want to be in the scene, and that's fine too. And so one way to think of it is, where am I? Am I in a landscape of the imagination, or am I in the real world right now? Like, am I on the roof of St. Mary-le-Bow right now, looking out and listening to what is coming in? Another thing that I wanted to draw attention to here is, even though you have the bongy academic talking, when Chris is walking up the stairs with the bell tower dude, there's still a bit of that, where am I at first, right? You don't know until he's on the roof and he says, we're on the tower of St. Mary-le-Bow. And if that scene started without the bongy academic, you might be drawn in into where are they going? What's going on here, right? And I think that sometimes when we're working with in-field sound for a journalistic endeavor, we think of the sound as evidence. Like, this was captured on site. So here's the proof, folks. This is real, right? But when we think about what our colleagues in television do, you think about how we live in a visual world, as the bongy guy said, which is one of the key things that he says, is we, very much are in control of what we see, and that's one of the reasons why we live in a world that it is visually dominated. We do play second fiddle. Audio plays second fiddle to visual in almost every sphere, except for obviously the enlightened ones who understand audio better. But our television colleagues have a profound understanding that what they're doing is not just presenting evidence when they put a picture up on the screen. They're also grabbing people, right? The evidence that a good visual piece, what they put on the screen is there to make you go, what? To make you look, to make you engage with what you're seeing. And so I think that, and I don't think they think of it in that way necessarily, because it's too obvious with visuals, right? You have to put a good visual on the screen, otherwise you're not making a good visual piece. And I think with audio, it's important to remember that it's not just evidence. It's also a way to grab people. It's also finding the sound in the piece that Chris finds with foghorn, or that Pike finds with the chair or the cough, is a way to grab people and engage them on the sonic sphere, on the sound that's going into their head that they can't control, that they have to just take in, like the meditation teacher says. You don't have to do anything. The sound just comes into you. And finding that sound and putting it in your piece intentionally as a way of saying, this is not just evidence, it's an interesting sound. And having the confidence and the faith that an interesting sound is going to compel someone to listen is another topsy-turvy way of coming at it. Instead of thinking, here's the evidence, it's like, yeah, it functions as evidence, but it also has another function, not just evidence.